Welcome, everybody, to the teach-in on current events in the Arab world, Return to Business as Usual After the Uprisings. This event is co-sponsored by a vast array of organizations. We are at George Mason University, sponsored by the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason. I'm Susan Douglas from the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. And other co-sponsors include the Arab Studies Institute, the Center for Global Islamic Studies, Global Affairs, Global Programs, History Department, and the Schar School of Policy and Government, Film and Media Studies at George Mason University. Our first speaker will be, I should also mention, by the way, that this program is funded by the Title VI grant. We are at Georgetown a National Resource Center on the Middle East and North Africa. So our funding, along with the funding from other donors, for example, for lunch, comes from the Title VI grant. So I want to introduce our first speaker, who is also the engine of this collaboration. This is our second one. We did another one last year on migration, is Bassam Haddad, who is director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program and associate professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He's the author of Business Networks in Syria, The Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience. Bassam serves as founding editor of the Arab Studies Journal and the Knowledge Production Project. He's co-producer and director of the award-winning documentary film About Baghdad and director of the series Arabs and Terrorism. Bassam is co-founder and editor of the Jadaliyya e-Zine and executive director of the Arab Studies Institute. He serves on the board of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences and is executive producer of Status Audio magazine. Bassam is co-project manager for Salon Syria Project and director of the Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative. Currently, he's working on 2 book projects, if you're not tired already, just hearing what all he does, and I don't know if he ever sleeps. He is working on 2 book projects, his second book on understanding the Syrian tragedy, regime opposition uprisings, and a co-edited volume on political economy of the Middle East, Stanford University Press. So Bassam is going to set the parameters for our day today.
Thank you all for being here and for joining us today. I am extremely happy about holding this event and having such an array of competent speakers who have an intimate relationship to not just the literature but also the region itself, addressing these important topics. I will be starting by looking at a broad view on the post-Arab uprising world, which actually involves a lot of discussion on the Arab uprisings themselves. And the subtitle is New Challenges, Old Bottles, and Muddied Vision. And the reason I have this subtitle is because I would like to convey that what we are witnessing is a combination of new sorts of challenges, but packaged in old bottles. In other words, these are not entirely new kinds of challenges. They are challenges that we have witnessed before, but they just have a different content to them. This is also a way of saying that those of us who focus too much on an entirely new situation and landscape are jettisoning the fact that these are more familiar to many of us than one might think. The muddied version or title or subtitle here refers to the fact that the dust has not yet settled, and I'll address this in a bit, and therefore we are in a situation where things don't seem as clear as one would like. I will try to keep to time. I have half an hour, so I will be reading my presentation, and I would like to see if I could manipulate the situation here so you can see me. All right. And I can see you. We often read about the post-uprising period or about the afterlife of the Arab uprisings and wonder whether we had time to take in, to absorb what actually happened, why it happened, and how it was subverted. The way the knowledge production industry works is part of the problem, and this includes all spheres from academia to journalism to the think tank world. And what is, in a way, the policy-making world, which seems at times to overtake everything else because of its dominance and its ability to project power. Within all these spheres, especially if taken together, we can observe a deep desire to feign newness, to incessantly produce and publish, and to make discoveries or innovations, basically to write that cutting-edge article or text that is definitive and trend-setting. While everyone is seeking to achieve, advertise, or instrumentalize truth, the primary victim is often truth itself. It is more instructive to take pause, to sit back, and first recognize that we are still in the midst of a transition from a tumultuous period whose full implications may have been set in motion but are not necessarily all too clear or visible yet. This should inform the decisiveness with which we make claims and advises tentativeness despite the importance of analyzing the now. Revolutions unfold through phases and stages, and now more than ever, this is the case, given the counter-revolutionary forces assembled are actually quite formidable. Yet, in all these spheres, we witness ample infringements. In academia, we observe what can be called instant scholarship, or otherwise not possible feat. Scholarship takes time, not only to produce it, but also to assemble all of the literature that has actually been written based on first or primary sources. In journalism, we continuously observe abridged realities that lack history, context, and often politics. Most detrimental, however, is what we receive from the policy world, given that policymakers need actionable knowledge now in whatever form it exists, and they do get it. Instead, what I plan to do in the next 25 minutes or so is to insist on starting from the beginning, to understand the uprisings as a multifaceted mass expression of dissent and opposition to the growing nexus of power between autocrats, corrupt economic actors, and both of their external supporters. This tripartite onslaught on the public in the region, in the Arab world in particular, for the prior 4 decades or more has produced bleak futures for new generations. Thus, in the clear absence of fundamental transformation today, the same conditions that gave rise to the social and political relations of power and the subsequent uprisings of 2011 will continue to foment dissent and revolt in years to come. In the meantime, everyone is recalculating, like our GPS. Autocrats and the regional and the international supporters are fortifying their castles, while generations of disenfranchised citizens are rethinking their approaches, strategies, compromises, and collective action modalities. New challenges and conflicts emerged in old bottles. That is, the content might be different, but the actual forms of the challenges are the same. I will address, or perhaps have time, to list some of these challenges and address others a bit more in detail. But first, let's take a look at how many of us look back at the uprisings, how we see the uprisings, given that we see them as something that just happened in the past. So the question is, what happened to the uprisings is something that's on everyone's mind, or has been on everyone's mind, or perhaps not anymore. Many ask, of course, this question, and the answers are obvious in the literature that we survey. And we have, at the Arab Studies Institute, a number of knowledge production platforms that actually chronicle and research these matters, and I try to use these materials in order to provide a quick survey as to how different sorts of people or institutions or circles see the uprisings. For casual observers, the Arab uprisings took a sharp turn to mayhem. That is what is visible on the television and, for the most part, heard on NPR as well as lesser venues. It's something that is a disaster, and that's that. It just didn't work. For cynical observers, The democratic uprisings in the Arab world were always an anomaly that was confirmed by consequences. These are the observers who always thought that these people, the Arabs, the Muslims, and so on, possess some cultural essence that will always hold them back. The momentary shock of watching hundreds of thousands of people facing bullets with their bare bodies was quickly overcome by these observers when more familiar tropes adorned television screens, namely, in quotation marks, jihadists roaming around and autocrats reclaiming their territory. For idealists, the uprisings were the true expression of the quest for freedom and dignity that must prevail, and must is the key word here, even in the short term. Unfortunately, and increasingly so, this is no longer the case and perhaps never was. Good things don't necessarily prevail. Without an understanding of the powers amassed against calls for emancipation and liberation, such wishful thinking is bound to continuously be disappointed. The reality is that the uprisings are more complex, less conclusive, and finally not over. A good starting point is to think less of the Arab uprisings or the Arab Spring as the unit of analysis and consider the 6 individual cases that experienced uprisings separately as 6 separate units of analysis. We shouldn't, and probably is a great mistake, to just talk of the Arab Spring as if it's one thing, as if it's one unit, and then analyze therefrom. We will actually end up being reductionist and essentialist despite our better judgment. Despite some commonality, each case involves a different history, society, state structures, and relations, both internal and external. The trajectory of each case reflects the interaction and synergy among all these factors in a rapidly changing region and, notably, a shifting global context in the past decade or so. We can time this from the economic collapse or the collapse of sorts in 2008. At least 2 broad factors impinged on outcomes. There are many more, but I'll discuss these 2. On the one hand, geopolitics penetrated in an extraordinary way each case in a particular manner that both thwarted expectations and reproduced either the pre-uprising structures of power, authoritarian rule, or the conflicts deeply embedded beneath their weight, perhaps with the relative exception of Tunisia. So if you look at Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, we see that with the exception of Tunisia, potentially, all of these cases have had international intervention affect the course of action within these cases in a manner that is extraordinary, perhaps unprecedented in some cases. On the other hand, the second broad factor, the uprisings ironically provided an entry point for new forms of calamity that came in 2 guises: either complete state collapse and attendant chaos and destitution, as we witness in Libya and in various dosages and locations in Syria, because the state didn't collapse everywhere in Syria. So that's one calamity that sort of, as I will share, caused some sort of rethinking of priorities by external actors as well as regional, international actors as well as regional actors, rethinking how they should respond to the uprisings. And on the other hand, we saw another form of calamity, in quotation marks, that made everyone take pause locally, regionally, and internationally, namely the emergence of totalitarian movements and sentiments, what is called in mainstream, in the mainstream world, in quotation marks, jihadists, that caused a recalibration of the preferences and patterns of coalition formation among powerful regional and international actors in response to this emergence, whereby the question was or became much more of a lesser evil question rather than what is actually a positive development. We can crudely call this the ISIS effect, but it is much more profound than that, and I will not discuss the various dimensions at this point. The status quo today in each of the cases with the possible exception of Tunisia. We keep saying with the possible exception of Tunisia because the truth is that Tunisia has a particular position within the other 6 cases such that it actually is the only potential bright light, but it also is mired in various forms of challenges that also my colleague Samia might actually discuss. The status quo today in all of these cases reflects in large measure the combination of various aspects of these 2 factors in addition to others in relation to their local and regional struggles, as well as the global positionality of the country in question. Not each of these countries is equally embedded in a global political economic order. So that actually changes the manner in which these countries emerge out of the uprising and whether they do. A good example is the US support for the Saudi Arabia army intervention in Bahrain to squash the democratic uprising there, and its current support, notwithstanding verbal proclamations of late. The support for Saudi Arabia's pummeling of Yemen is part and parcel of the counter-revolutionary effort to prevent the destabilizing of an allied sub-region that sits atop the largest energy reserves worldwide. And of course, there are various dimensions and nuances here that I also am hoping that my colleague Rosie Bshir would address. How did we get here? From interstate deterioration to intrastate deterioration, where the gloves have finally come off, even within the rubric of Arab authoritarian rule. In the 1970s and even part of the 1980s, there was a pretense of solidarity, if not actual solidarity, between various Arab states, notwithstanding enmities. That pretense evaporated in the post-Soviet Union collapse and gave rise to bilateralism with the United States among most Arab countries, for the most part. This process was accompanied by the loss of a moral economy where states were held accountable to the basic well-being of their citizens through their public sector redistributive policies and largesse. Even within the context of growing corruption and authoritarian rule, you still had a state welfare, a set of state welfare policies that kept most of society afloat, especially the most vulnerable segments. Shades of the moral economy formula was, because there are different shades, Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere, and of course that compares with the more rentier states that actually have lots of oil and gas. And that is another issue that can come up in the Q&A. Shades of the moral economy formula were substituted by more explicit forms of economic liberalization in the 1990s, and the pretense that political liberalization will be the next step that will help compensate, along with the freer market, for the loss of the state welfare policies. These policies were described or are described under the rubric of neoliberal policies supported by the United States and its allies, as well as international financial institutions that serviced or reserviced the debt of many of the developing countries in the region and beyond. By the 1990s, neither political liberalization nor economic efficiency and productivity of the private sector materialized. However, the promise of democratization through an expanded civil society within the context of economic and political liberalization turned out to be a pipe dream. The market, the free market, was not the answer. Widespread social alienation, accompanied by socioeconomic injustices, began to set in alongside the customary lack or absence of meaningful political participation. Broad deterioration of the Arab state system in the 1970s and 80s, that is, deteriorating relations between states, this is what I'm referring to by the Arab state system deteriorating, was thus followed by deterioration within the states themselves, not just between the states, in the 1990s, ushering in multiple internal crises and schisms, including economic, institutional, and both identity and governance-related ones. And I am necessarily speaking here in broad terms because I'm trying to capture the various developments within a region of 22 countries or so. In some cases, this led to the emergence of non-state actors who fulfilled some of the functions of the state, further eroding the state's legitimacy and fueling discontent among the most vulnerable and marginalized. The state of affairs, which we saw in the 90s and the 2000s, that combines political, economic, social, and identitarian crisis, identity-related crises, brewed for more than 10 years in the new century, with its effect mitigated, however, by a number of local, regional, and international developments, which sort of prolonged the life of authoritarian rule, of economic exploitation, of dependency on external patrons. Not least of these factors that prolonged these formulas of authoritarian rule and exploitation were the war on terror and the Iraq invasion. The war on terror, among others, of course. The war on terror gave a carte blanche to dictators in the region to prosecute, pursue, and silence dissent and the opposition in the name of fighting terrorism, as we saw in Egypt and elsewhere. And the Iraq invasion gave tangible credence to the lesser evil argument. That is, at least we're not as bad as Iraq. The Syrians, did I just say that? Syrians, after 2003, 4, and 5, were basically, of course, next door and thinking about what could happen in Syria as a function of the then campaign to actually strike Syria, campaign here next door, down the street, to strike Syria. And the idea was very interesting because for the first time in decades, perhaps, it created a really odd overlap of position between the people and the Syrian regime for a short period of time, and then, of course, it fell apart. During the second part of the first decade of the 21st century, which is a very problematic way of saying after 2005, it seems that all Arab regimes were there to stay. But all the factors, processes, and shocks above were fermenting something much deeper and quite difficult to identify at the time. The readiness to revolt in multiple cases was brewing. Bouazizi in Tunisia, immolating himself, sparked an always already existing avalanche of protest or readiness for protest that lingered under the surface. The rest is history. The domino effect or the demonstration effect that followed the Tunisian uprising. It's been almost 8 years since the start of the uprisings, and as shared above, it sometimes seems that not much has actually changed because we have a reversion, but actually it has. In the current, and not in a positive direction, if you exclude the one thing that, or at least one thing that is a bright light, and that is the cliche of power of the people has actually become real and is something that has triggered certain responses from what is called the new authoritarianism that is overtaking the entire region. In the current atmosphere, precisely speaking, of internal challenges and external support for the status quo, this counter-revolutionary status quo, there is no longer of pretense among authoritarian regimes of the Arab world of embracing the public interest, which is sort of the distinction in a way between the new Sisi regime in Egypt and the previous Mubarak regime in Egypt before 2011. There's no such pretense of embracing the public interest or pretending to embrace the public interest in the same manner that existed. Rather, at least in action, rather, in terms of action, the more traveled path by regimes today and governments under the rubric of a new authoritarianism is to subvert the public's interest with ample help from external actors that keep seeking to salvage an ever more thin veneer of stability lest things explode and matters get out of hand. But that is precisely where things are inexorably headed. For many years, I was unable to say the word inexorably without repeating it several times until I get it right. This morning, I held my daughter's hand while she was sleeping, and I divided inexorably to two things, in and exorably. And I realized how simple some challenges are to overcome. I just wasted like 17 seconds of like precious 4K video. With this knowledge in mind, the next round of protests is likely to be met with unprecedented viciousness. Basically, it'll all be a la Syria regime. In the meantime, we have on our hands several types of crises or challenges and an intricate and perhaps intractable web of conflicts. The issues to consider are many, and my colleagues will address several of them. The Yemeni calamity, the refugee crisis, rising unemployment, and what I discussed about the new authoritarianism. Half of Yemen's population is in risk of starvation, let alone the spread of diseases throughout a defenseless population. A lot more can be said about this, but I have to move on. The refugee crisis. Today, more than 30 million Arabs are displaced in one form or another, including half of the Syrian population, with all sorts of risk and potential disasters looming in various camps and locations. Rising unemployment and poverty is surely going to continue to rise unabated, and it has reached levels that surpass the 2011 levels, which were already some of the highest in the world. Figures vary between 30 and 48 or 55%, depending on the location. And this rise in unemployment, much more so the rise in poverty, because poverty doesn't produce revolutions necessarily. This rise in unemployment and the acquisition of means to actually act will likely reproduce a more resolute wave of protests that will likely be sparked by some unforeseen incident. But against those who say we are not going to experience uprisings for a very long time, this is actually a looming or imminent development. And we're not talking about next year or the year after or even in a couple of few years. But this is not over. In other words, the uprisings first phase is just what it says. It's the first phase. The new authoritarianism, in response to all the above, we are witnessing not only the maturation of counter-revolutionary forces and alliances led by conservative forces in the region like Saudi Arabia and Egypt with external support like the United States. We can actually observe a more bold new authoritarianism that is not reluctant to employ naked forms of power to suppress dissent and eliminate threats. The worst is actually yet to come. Other issues involve women's empowerment and predicament, which my colleague Hiba Judeli will discuss, Sunni radicalization and its consequences, realignment and trouble in the Gulf, which I hope my colleague Rosie Bshir would discuss, Turkey's ostensibly being out of the US orbit for now, and then the Arab warming relations with Israel across the Arab Gulf specifically, and the implications of that for the Palestinian question, which I'm hoping that my colleague Mu'in might actually brush up upon. I will conclude by selectively addressing some current cases of conflict and what I termed the muddied vision. As I shared earlier, the muddied vision refers to the post-uprisings dust that has not yet settled completely, but more concretely to the complex web of overlapping and intersecting conflicts that had an ironic effect. We have never seen the intricacy we are observing today in terms of the overlapping conflicts active simultaneously. The ironic effect of this is that these necessarily drew in regional and international players, these conflicts that is, but most of these players have their hands tied behind their backs for the most part amid the potential counterproductive nature of any policy, because any policy is likely to produce counterproductive effects given the overlapping of interests and, the overlapping of conflicts. And I'll discuss some of these very quickly. I'll only discuss Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt, and Iran very quickly, although it seems like a mouthful, handful, or something full. Syria as pivotal. The best example is the ostensibly still going or not yet over Syrian uprising, which lies at the intersection of nearly all existing regional conflicts and encapsulates most of the new challenges. Syria lies at the intersection of the Arab-Israeli conflict, at the intersection of the Iran-Saudi conflict, where it itself Hezbollah and Iran are on one side, Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, and perhaps Egypt to an extent, and their external supporters are on the other. And of course, Syria has Russia and China and other very few other powers on its side as well, but effective powers nonetheless, as we've seen in the Russian intervention in Syria, which actually saved the regime. It also lies at the intersection of the quote-unquote Sunni-Shi'i tensions in the region. It lies at the intersection of resistance versus imperialism, and all of these things are in quotation marks, conflict in the region. So Syria's case is always, or has been, perhaps more than most cases, if not all cases, more than just about Syria, which is why the entire universe descended upon Syria. And that creates problems for almost any policy vis-a-vis Syria. If you consider the Kurds and the question of Kurdish self-determination in Turkey, if you consider the question of ISIS and how it recalibrated positions in the United States and elsewhere, including the Arab Gulf, regarding how far to push arming the rebels and so on, it becomes clear why half measures is the resultant outcome in policy making. The Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is another example or focal point around which we witness alignment and counter-alignments in the region, with Saudi Arabia and UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt on one side, and Qatar and Turkey on the other. Whether in Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Palestine, or elsewhere, these two camps are locked in a competitive struggle either to prop up or undermine the chances of the Muslim Brotherhood in making a comeback, rising to prominence or partaking in governance, as is happening in Libya, for instance. Egypt's predicament, and they're all related. Egypt is allied, and this is going to get confusing. I wanted to have a graph, but then I thought maybe I shouldn't. Egypt is allied with Saudi Arabia and the UAE against the Muslim Brotherhood and ostensibly Iran. Definitely for Saudi Arabia and UAE, they're allied against Iran. Even though Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood are not allies. But Egypt is not willing to go as far as its allies, Saudi Arabia for instance, in openly undermining Iran, mainly to preserve a semblance of independence for itself as the historically other big power in the region other than Saudi Arabia. And because Iran has some influence over Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, which is too close to the troubled Egyptian Sinai region. Moreover, Iran is a stalwart supporter of the Syrian regime, which was the target of overthrow by Egypt's ally, Saudi Arabia. However, the Egyptian president, Sisi, never hid his admiration for how the Syrian regime dealt with and squashed Sunni radicalism, considering it a model behavior to be emulated. So it's complex, the extent to which these are real camps and have clear positions vis-a-vis members of other camps. This complicates their own policies, and this complicates the policies of their patrons regarding the conflict. Iran, the biggest winner until perhaps recently, as a function of the sanctions and so on. Iran's yet second win after its winning the table in the post-Iraq invasion period, which it did win the table. Probably shouldn't use gambling language. I don't even know how to gamble. In a casino, I don't know how to gamble. After its winning the table in post-Iraq invasion, in the post-Iraq invasion period, Iran actually won in Syria. And that win, or that success, or that positionality that it achieved for itself in Syria had regional reverberations. This fueled the animosity of the already existing Saudi Arabian enemy and its allies. It also raised serious concerns for an already semi-trembling Israel and a new excited representative of American machismo, our own President Trump. It was a ménage à trois made in Qum, or in heaven. USA, KSA, and Israel, KSA is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Israel found common cause in uniting to pull the rug from under Iran's success in various ways, and this is something that is in motion, and we will probably see more manifestations of it. I actually have reached my limit. I have a lot more to say, but I will close, and maybe we can have a Q&A about other topics, and I'm happy to participate in other Q&A sessions because our sessions are more limited than the others. I have the bottom line, let me just close with this, in all of this, is that the victims of the muddy vision and intersecting conflicts has been the ordinary Arab citizen, not least in Syria and Yemen, as well as Libya, Bahrain, and beyond. And this is precisely why this moment is critical, in the sense that we are witnessing a naked aggression against ordinary citizens, especially the least vulnerable. And the worst part, if you will, to use plain language, is that we here in the United States, as a foreign policy, are complicit in much of it, even if Russia and other international players are as well. Thank you very much.